Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you for joining us. Today we are launching the World Risk Report 2015. This is the international launch that is being live streamed. And we're hoping that a lot of you have logged on and are following discussions and will be asking questions later on. I'm quickly going to explain the procedure and then we'll get going and I'll introduce the panel as we go along. You have three opportunities or possibilities to ask questions to the panel. We have a moderator named Artie Bassanet who is monitoring all three channels. She will respond to you once you pose your questions and we'll actually read them out to the panel so that you can follow the respective answers. You can ask us questions via email to media@vie.unu.edu. Also through Twitter. Our Twitter handle is UNU-EHS, that's all together. And you can also post the questions through the chat window that you will see next to the live streaming window. And you'll get a response as soon as you post your questions. I'd now like to invite our first speaker to make a statement. We're going to have brief statements today. We're going to try to stick to 15 minutes maximum in terms of presentation, and then we'll open the floor for questions. I'd like to invite Mr. Peter Mucke, who is the CEO of Alliance Development Works, a well-known German alliance of German NGOs. He's also the managing director of the World Risk Report, and he will open with the first statement today. Mr. Mucke.
Thank you, Janine Kandel. Dear ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy to present you the World Risk Report, which focuses on food security in 2015. This report is jointly published by the Alliance Bündnis Entwicklung Hilft and the United Nations University in Bonn. This year, the IREUS Institute of the University of Stuttgart is among our partners. In the context of the collaboration referred to above, we have developed the WorldRiskIndex. Our basic concept consists of calculating the disaster risk of countries with an individual country's exposure to natural hazards and its vulnerability. Here we analyze the extreme weather events and natural hazards that result in the worst damage. In the societal sector, we analyze people's susceptibility, the coping capacities that a country has, and its preventive measures to address future natural hazards and extreme weather events. Professor Bergman is subsequently going to explain the details of the World Risk Index and its indicators. Our focus on food security this year demonstrates its incomplete clarity that crises and disasters cause hunger. Furthermore, it demonstrates that the disastrous effects of natural hazards such as earthquakes and cyclones can be countered by food security for the people. Those who suffer hunger are more vulnerable in disasters, wars, and conflicts. This year, analysis by the UN University have demonstrated that there is no statistical link between hunger and disaster risk. Mr. Garshang will present this analysis to you afterwards. We have therefore worked with a further analyzing approach and chosen the 68 countries with a high and very high level of exposure. Out of these 68 countries, we were able to determine the level of food insecurity of 64 countries with the aid of 5 selected indicators. For example, we included both the relative food prices for these countries in our analysis and the global hunger index of our member organization Welthungerhilfe. Thus, we were able to establish 5 groups of countries. A very urgent need for action prevails in the countries of Bangladesh, Burundi, Haiti, Cameroon, and several others. There is an urgent need for action in another group and a need for action in one further group, which are both, they are represented by, for example, Indonesia and Albania. There is no statistical link between food insecurity and disaster risk, although they do reinforce each other. Not only do disasters often have a devastating impact on countries' food situation, food insecurity conversely also raises disaster risk. For example, people are more strongly exposed to natural hazards when a lack of food security forces them to migrate. In the new settlement areas, they are then often left with those spaces bearing a greater disaster risk, such as steeple slopes or riverbanks. While around 1.2 billion people more, as much as the present population of India would have to be fed by 2030, there is a good prospect of achieving the international agreed zero hunger target by 2030. In terms of volume, there is enough food for everyone. In contrast, in acute conflicts and wars, food security is threatened. Just like in disasters, hunger and migration are then consequences. Since it is difficult to solve some of the current conflict, there is an urgent need for food supplies in the neighboring countries and in the refugee camps. This also calls for better food supplies for the people in the crisis areas and the refugee camps. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mucke. I'd like to turn the microphone over to our next speaker to my left, Dr. Matthias Garschagen. He's an academic section head for the United Nations University's Institute for Environment and Human Security. He's also the scientific director of the World Risk Report. Matthias.
Thanks, Janine, and good day to everybody, to all the listeners and viewers all around the globe. As Peter Mucke has just indicated, what we do with the World Risk Report once per year is to analyze the risk of countries globally to experience disaster. Now, we do this by means of looking at two sides of disaster risk, and this is on the one hand side, we look at the exposure towards natural hazards such as floods, storms, earthquakes. So the percentage of the population that is exposed, physically exposed to those potential hazards. But on the other side, we look also at the societal vulnerabilities within these countries. So the question, how susceptible are these societies when faced with hazards? And here we look into issues such as healthcare, issues such as economic income levels, social disparities, and so forth. And also we look into the response capacities with respect to these hazards. So how well are societies prepared to deal with hazards, firefighters, health response teams, and so forth on the ground. Now, what we clearly see in the disaster, in the report, is that natural hazards don't necessarily have to turn into disaster. Rather, the societal vulnerability is really one of the key determinants for the question whether or not a hazard turns into a disaster. We can exemplify this along two examples. If you think back a couple of years, we had a major earthquake in New Zealand, in Christchurch, and a year earlier we had an earthquake in Haiti. Now, the Christchurch earthquake was quite devastating and caused roughly 180 casualties. On the other hand, the Haiti earthquake, similar strength, caused more than 220,000 casualties. So here you can already see that this cannot exclusively be explained by the strength of the hazard, but more by the internal vulnerability. Now, these differences can be explained through a number of issues, and one of those issues is hunger and malnutrition. This is why we looked into in-depth into this topic with this year's report. And what we find basically is that hunger and malnutrition has impact on all four dimensions of disaster risk as identified in the report. So we see, for example, that particularly in food-poor years, farmers often have to revert to flood-prone areas for their agricultural production. Also in terms of temporal extension, fishermen, for example, in Southeast Asia often have to extend their fishing season into the storm season. We also see that malnourished children, for example, have a higher susceptibility when faced with floods or storms or other disasters to suffer impacts. So even on the susceptibility side, we see strong impacts. We also see the impacts on the coping side in systems where there's a lack of food storage, for example, a lack of food stocks. Then food is not available in crisis situations where it will be needed the most, actually. So even there, we see quite an increase of malnutrition and poverty on the disaster impact. We looked into the relationship between both hunger and disaster risk. And we try to identify global patterns. Where do we see hotspots where this is overlapping? Now, what's quite interesting is we find that particularly the vulnerability side, so the inherent societal vulnerabilities towards disasters, overlap quite strongly with hunger globally. So we see that particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, we have countries which are faced, a lot of the countries with both of these hazards, and they are amongst the leaders, poorly so, globally in both respects. We see less of an overlap, on the other hand, with between the exposure side, so the natural hazard side, and the hunger. So this already shows us that hunger and disaster risk is much more determined by the societal inherent vulnerabilities rather than only by the external hazards. This means that disaster risk reduction has to be understood as one principal component of hunger reduction, and vice versa. Hunger reduction needs to be really understood as one of the key factors for achieving disaster prevention. And we develop a couple of recommendations, which the next speaker is going to explain in more detail. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthias. I'd now like to invite Professor Radke, who is here for the Welthungerhilfe today, which is a German NGO that forms is an essential part of Aligned Development Works. Professor Radke, please.
Thank you, Mrs. Kandel, and hello to the audience. As Matthias Garshagen said before, the World Risk Report this year focused on the interplay between food security and disaster risk. And the key message of our report this year is that the lack of food security and disaster risk reinforce each other. Actually, the first part of this relationship is quite well-established fact. Disasters can have an immediate and drastic impact on food security. The most recent example, I think you have it all in mind, is Nepal, where the earthquake destroyed food stocks, seeds and agricultural tools, as well as markets, and 1.4 million people were in need of food assistance. The second part of our message is often overlooked, and so far it has by no means gained acceptance among central political decision makers that also malnutrition and hunger exacerbates disaster risk. For example, malnourished people are more susceptible to disasters due to their body condition, and people living in food insecurity have less coping capacities because they are not able to build food stocks. These are only two examples. Translated into political strategies, this means that if we want to prevent disasters, we need also to take into account policy fields that are important for food security. Now, according to the Food and Agriculture Organizations, investments in agriculture are 5 times more efficient in reducing hunger than measures in any other sector. So it's for us quite clear what we have to focus on. So it means in order to prevent disasters, we have to focus also on agricultural policy and on development concepts for rural regions, and of course also on climate policy. We came up with a number of recommendations in our report, and I will only focus on a few here. To national governments and actors in development cooperation, we recommend, first of all, to strengthen small holders in rural regions, for example, through cultivation methods, diversified cultivation and better irrigation management. All of these measures would not only promote food security, but also disaster resilience. We would also recommend to develop infrastructure and transport capacities and markets in rural areas as part of national risk reduction strategies. To develop and implement preventive food strategies would be another recommendation for the occurrence of extreme weather events. For example, this could be something like decentralized forms of warehousing and suitable measures to maintain social security, as well as micro-insurance schemes that could be supported by governments. To ensure policy coherence and make sure that disaster prevention, agricultural policy, trade and investment policy and the protection of the environment are not a contradiction, this would be another very important point for us. To make every, and then we have another important recommendation for the international community, and that is to make every endeavor to implement the resolutions that were adopted in 2015 at the UN Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction in Japan, on financing for sustainable development in July in Addis Abeba, and on the new development agenda in September in New York. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Radke. I'd now like to invite our fourth and final speaker, Professor Jörn Bergmann from the University of Stuttgart, which is an important cooperation partner for the World Risk Report. Professor Bergmann and his team are also responsible for calculating the World Risk Index. Jörn, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Janine. And as indicated, with the team, Dr. Weller and I were calculating the index. What is new in the index? For about 15 indicators out of 28 indicators, the index covers or captures 50. For 15 indicators, we had also new data, particularly for the socioeconomic vulnerability parameters. And here, definitely, the top ranking is still Vanuatu, a small island state in Oceania, but interestingly, Vanuatu was also impacted actually by a major storm in March 2015. It was interesting to observe that the fatalities were rather not so dramatic. More than 40 people died, according to official statistics, but more than 80% of the population of the entire island was negatively affected. And that means also that the index actually gives evidence or provides interesting information about the fact what we are interested to observe. Are we interested in extreme events, or are we actually interested in the question of which event causes extreme impacts? And here, for example, also two other storms are quite important. For example, Hurricane Sandy in the United States was a major event also captured by the media with 115 miles per hour. Approximately 200 fatalities compared, for example, to Typhoon Haiyan 1 year later with 187 miles per hour caused more than 6,000 fatalities. And this shows that the extreme events have very different impacts. And this is important also, which is, I think, documented here in the World Risk Index this year. Another, I think, remark on the topic of food security is interesting. If you look into the country that is ranks highest on the vulnerability, that is a Central African Republic, actually with 74 points or percentages being the highly or the most vulnerable country in the world, it is interesting to observe that they have even worsened the situation. So, for example, those who the number of people undernourished increased from 2014 to 2015 from about 28% to today about 38%. So here, even if we have a world with the goal of zero hunger, we have some countries which are highly developing in a different direction. And here, I think both results are important. On the one hand, to look at the risk composition of exposure and vulnerability, but also to look at countries which still have a very high vulnerability, which should be addressed, particularly in the context of medium and long-term risk reduction measures. Thank you.
Thank you, Jörn. We'd now like to open the floor for questions, and I'd like to kick off with a question to all of you. World leaders will gather in Paris in December to negotiate a new climate agreement. In the lead up to Paris, is there any essential key message also based on your findings in the report that you would like to send to Paris?
I think what we see quite clearly in the report is that the disaster risk from extreme events is currently driven, and I mentioned it, and Jörn Böckmann also mentioned it, is currently driven very much by inherent vulnerabilities in addition to the hazard event. What we might see, though, in future is that the signal that we're seeing from extreme events, so from the hazard events, that this is increasing. So we might see more extreme events in the intensity, and we might see more frequent of those events. Now, what our report says is that those will have double impact on food security, on disaster risk, and need to be understood in a coherent manner. So climate change adaptation all of a sudden becomes an issue that is not only adhering to disaster risk reduction, but also to food security quite drastically. And this is, I think, what needs to be understood to understand, as we have mentioned, to understand hunger reduction as one principal component within disaster risk reduction, hence climate change adaptation, and the other way around, to see that hunger reduction cannot be sustainable if there is no sufficient disaster prevention.
Thank you, Matthias. Mr. Mucke, would you like to comment?
I think there are two messages for us very important with regard to the World Risk Report. The one is that really the leaders of the world need to reduce the effects of climate change, and we need to see that there is not more than 2 degrees, which the temperature will be higher. That is the one point. But the other point is that in the adaptive measures, we also need to focus on the people in the rural areas, so to help them to adapt to all the results of climate change.
Good. Maybe a remark from my side to the question of the lead up to Paris. I think a lot of countries also highly at risk, for example, like Bangladesh, have improved significantly their risk management strategy, shelter program, early warning systems. But what we are still, I think, have not sufficiently answered yet, at least from the research side and also in the policy process, is it's not only about a 1.5, 2 or 3 degree world, so in terms of increasing climate change, but the significant question is also what kind of time scale we are talking about. Do countries which are highly vulnerable, like Vanuatu, Bangladesh, the Philippines, what are the time spans, for example, we have to still adapt, and what kind of resources and maybe also adaptation measures can be really taken, which go far beyond technical early warning system, but also imply, for example, cultural changes in migration patterns, etc. And here I think one of the messages also indirectly of the report is that we have to also view adaptation as a rather broader concept and also define quality criteria. If the Central African Republic has a significant problem with hunger, it all has also to do, for example, with governance and military conflicts. And here I think adaptation issues and risk reduction issues have to have the broader focus in order to be successful.
Thank you, Jan. Professor Radke, final remark from you?
I could maybe only add a very short remark, and this is like a message to the leaders that will meet in Paris. I think the most ambitious prevention strategies against disasters, they will not be sufficient if the community of states now in Paris will not take action on limiting climate change. And that means really addressing the causes of climate change and dealing with the root causes of the problem.
Thank you. Are there any final remarks from the panel? Okay. We're expecting a little bit of a time delay with the live stream. So I'd like to ask the panel if there are any final remarks. We're going to close the press conference where our experts are going to be available for the next 30 minutes to answer questions through either email, still the live chat function, or Twitter, and can also chat bilaterally. Are there any final remarks from the panel? Okay, then we'd like to conclude the press conference. Thank you very much for watching, and we'd be happy to interact with you over the next 30 minutes.